This podcast was made possible by our members on armchairhistory.tv. Use code ARMCHAIRCHATS for 60% off of your first month. Welcome back to another episode of the Armchair Chats podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce not just a fellow YouTube creator, but a good friend of mine. Please welcome Brandon F., the British loyalist behind the channel that bears his name. With 174,000 subscribers, he delves deep into historical events, typically spanning the 18th and 19th centuries, covering a broad array of topics. Brandon, it's great to have you on. How are you today?
I am doing quite well, sir. Thank you very much. That's very formal. I wasn't expecting such professionalism out of the blue.
Something that you will not know until this moment is we're going to draw you, and the viewers can see this now, but we're going to draw you in your classic red coat outfit for the podcast. I was debating of putting you in like a full morning suit or putting you in the red coat outfit, but I figured your profile picture has you in that nice Napoleonic outfit.
Yeah,
so
that's
I think we're
a little
gonna go
bit
with
more
that.
Appropriate. I need to get back to the actual stage of making videos in this outfit. Hopefully sooner rather than later. All the stuff is over in the UK, but I should have access to it fairly soon.
So do you have outfits that you keep in the UK, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, basically, the Napoleonic outfit is something that I only ever do in the UK. The group is called the Coldstream Guards 1815. They're based out of England. And whenever I go over to that country is when I'm able to do Napoleonic events. But I don't officially own the uniform because I'm not a full member. It's more like I have a relationship with them where, it's like, oh hey, I'm gonna be in the UK for this month that you're doing an event. Can I swing on by and do the event with you guys? And the leader of the group will just bring an extra set of everything and provide it for me when I'm there. So it's kind of like an on again, off again relationship with that group. But then when I'm hopefully over there a lot more regularly, I'll be able to become a full proper member, actually buy my own stuff, and then of course have access to it for video content. Otherwise, if it's just I'm not currently a member of any Revolutionary War groups, so I don't have the classic red coat look. Currently, but
did you own that uniform you had for? Was it the 54th?
Yeah, the 54th was my old group. I did own all that stuff, and I either sold off or gave all of it away when I left that group, just to I figure help new people get involved with the hobby. And reenactors can get really what's a nice way to put it? They can get really petty and really specific. That it's I'm not necessarily saying that it's petty, but if you show up in a particular uniform, if there are reenactors of that unit, everyone's just going to assume right off the bat, oh, you're associated with this group. It's well, no, they don't own that uniform. So I'm not I think that if I were to continue making videos in the 54th kit, I'm not saying the 54th would sue me or be angry about it, but people would make that association, and I didn't necessarily want that to be the case, so I gave all that stuff away basically. But I still have my World War I and my World War II kits, and they're just shoved in the closet. Okay. I do own all that stuff. Yeah. It's stuffed away in boxes, currently buried under a lot of other boxes, and I need to try and see if I can't find all my World War I stuff, because there are a few little improvements and alterations I need to make in preparation for the next World War I event, which is going to be just about a month from now, actually, and I'm very excited for it.
So that you're going to be doing World War I and World War II events. You're going to find one of those in the U.S. If/when you move to the UK, are you going to be able to keep up with those? How would your reenacting adventures change when you make the move, do you think?
Good question, really. When it comes to Napoleonic and 18th century stuff, I'm just going to be able to do more of that. That's going to get stronger, I think. World War I, I'm definitely going to keep all of the stuff, because there's an event in rural Pennsylvania called Newville. Colloquially, it's called Newville, because that's where the event is held. It's a private event, so there's no public on bleachers asking you are you the Confederates, or none of that stuff. It is just, it's in the middle of a random field where I guess where the association that runs the event bought the land, I guess, and they actually went and dug out trenches. And when you go to that field, it basically feels like you're in 1916, 1917. It's just a really cool event. Like it's one of those events that's like it's basically on for like 16 hours a day or whatever when you get there. So people are doing like nighttime trench raids, and flare guns are going all up over the night, and it's not like scripted or anything. At least it's not scripted beyond like the highest level up officers who maybe know what's going on. So like, if I am told with my, for example, this November, I'm going to be going out with the South Wales Borderers. It's a new group that I'm a member of now. If I'm sitting there, in the muddy hole of a trench, it's raining and miserable, and it's like, well, we have to, it's our job now to get guys out, like, at the forward outpost to listen for the enemy. Like, all right, Brandon, you and Marcio, it's you two now. It's like, oh, all right then, fine. So we grab our rifles, we get to go out there. We have to crawl over no man's land, over to the forward outpost, hope we don't get hit by a sniper or anything. And we just get to sit there and listen, because a German trench raid could genuinely just come at any time. We can, like, peer our heads over, but then if the enemy shoots up a flare, we better duck down, because then we're going to get spotted, and the enemy's going to know where the outpost is, and all that fun stuff. It's, like, it's a very real kind of event in that there's maybe, like, little bursts of extreme excitement when action actually takes place, but then for the most part, it's just kind of like being cold and miserable and wet and muddy, and it's a vibe. It's such a vibe.
Now, you've made a video on this, I'm pretty sure, but I think that you mentioning that it's a private event, it's not as scripted, it's more for that kind of immersion and people experiencing what it would be like. I think you've made a video on how reenactors take their hits. And if you could speak a bit on maybe how that works, and what if there's any kind of like informal agreement, or maybe an officer when he sends you out says, okay, you're gonna die for this section because it's gonna be cooler if we do it that way. I'm curious how private events would differ from public events, or how specific regiments do it, or if there are any kind of differences in those, and how that works. Yeah.
So, man, that was an old video. That was way back when. I feel the need to remake it actually sometimes. But the basic gist of it is that it really is all just a gentleman's agreement. People will ask, like, oh, why don't you use, like BBs or paintball or laser or something, like all those sorts of things, right?
Lasers,
laser tag. And the basic gist of it is because the goal of, like, reenactment as opposed to airsoft or LARPing or paintball or whatever is that the core of the experience isn't really the competitiveness, it is the immersion. So if we were to have people go out with, like, BBs or whatever, well, then all of a sudden everyone also needs to be wearing eye protection. It's like, well, it would be kind of ruin the appearance and kind of the feel, the vibe of it, if you will. If everyone's running around with these like $3,000 like super authentic, hands-made, period-appropriate clothing and everything, and then they're running around with, like, an airsoft gun and wearing Air Pros or whatever Ear Pros, that's the name of the headphones. But and wearing like goggles.
With a GoPro, like
it would kind of mess with the with like that immersion factor a little bit. Then there's also, of course, the factor that you could damage the clothing. I'm sure most reenactors out there would probably be like, oh, I'll take a BB, like, to the groin or whatever. That's fine. I can just go to the hospital. But the clothing, you can't just replace that stuff that easily. It doesn't heal naturally on you. And especially so with, like, paintballs and everything. It's like, if you were to splatter paint,
that would be disastrous.
On this like $3,000 outfit,
just ruin it.
That ain't gonna fly. So it really is just a matter of, like, if you feel it is appropriate, if, like, say, for example, in a public, like, Revolutionary War or Napoleonic War event, right? So linear combat, you're standing in the formations and everything. It's primarily a matter of, like, okay, well, my gun is no longer working, or it's really hot and I'm really tired, or something has happened and I need to fall out. Like, any number of things. Like, if your personal preference is, all right, I need to go down now, then wait for the enemy to fire their next volley, and then you can fall down. Or you can just ask an officer to like fall out, pretend like you're wounded, or whatever that would be. Now, sometimes as well, the scenario can call for individuals to take their hits. So, like, if the battle calls for like Team Red to lose, then they're probably going to be taking more hits than Team Blue because it like feels better for the crowd that way, I suppose.
Right.
Like if you're in the middle of a desperate last retreat, people tend to take more hits there because like they're actively being told by their officers like, hey, we need to start losing guys because we need to lose today, and we have too many, and like we're actually outnumbering, so it won't look right if we lose with this many people, and blah blah blah, like little things like that. The course of the actual event can dictate like what has to happen in that way. One of the biggest things that I've seen it happen so many times, and it really bothers me, both as a spectator and as a participant, of course, is like when people will so dogmatically stick to the plan, quote unquote, whatever it is, or they won't have an appropriate awareness of the plan, which effectively just means that they do things that are very inappropriate. I feel like within the reenactment community, there's something of a divide, right? Between is it almost like a game? Is it like sport where it's like, oh, we're gonna get the flank on him and do this fancy stuff and then we'll like win, quote unquote, or is it like a play? Is it a performance where you're putting on a show? Personally, right. I stand very much more on the latter side. I believe that reenactment is like a giant improv performance. So if it looks good for the crowd, they're like, okay, if one side is like doing a bayonet charge against you or whatever, and they're coming up like right against you, like, well, according, for example, to the rules of the Brigade of the American Revolution, like the North American Revolutionary War reenactments, you're not allowed to have physical contact, like with bayonets or anything. There's no melee combat, which means if one side launches a bayonet charge, either the charge needs to fail or the other side needs to break. But the number of times that I've seen people like do bayonet charges and like neither side is backing down, and so they both just kind of like stand there, and then the other side like, oh, okay, now they just turn around and walk away. It's like, what the heck was that? This looks horrible. Yeah. Or two sides standing there next to each other, just blazing away for like an impossibly long amount of time. It's like, no, fire a volley, bayonet charge, either have it break or have it succeed, but like everyone should be on the same page here of like, it doesn't matter what like you think looks cool for your unit, like what looks good for the event, what feels most historically appropriate. Because if I'm standing there as like a regular army unit and I've shot 5 or 6 volleys into like 5 militiamen who just refuse outright to turn around and walk away, like what the heck? Like what that's just very, very silly. And it's happened a lot of times where like a single unit of a couple of guys just refuses to play by, play in a way that makes sense. And it kind of makes everything look and feel a lot sillier. And not to
now,
say...
Is that more common in like a publicly organized event or a private event? Is there a difference in that sort of thing?
Well, what I would say is I think that sort of thing is most common in events where it's easy or obvious to see, right? Like that only happens really in like linear warfare events. I've only really experienced it in Rev War events. I've only been a part of like very, very small battle demonstrations for Napoleonics in the UK, and it's not as much of a problem there because it's like everyone knows each other pretty directly, and they just like, all right, we'll do this, then you guys will do that. Okay, cool, we're all on the same page. Like if you get to an event with like 600 soldiers or whatever, like Battle of Monmouth or whatever here in the States, it gets pretty big. Obviously, coordination gets a lot trickier, and you can run into that kind of thing. So when it comes to like the smaller private events, especially like the World War I, World War II stuff, it's not as much of a problem because the combat is all a lot more fluid, I think. And in general, it just seems like because it's like they tend to be smaller events and they tend to be like invite only. People tend to be a little bit more on the same page as far as like, okay, I see there that, some guy was aiming at me and I got hit, or like, okay, I went across an open field and I heard a lot of gunfire, so I'm probably downed. Things like that. People tend to be pretty good about it. And because it isn't like so in your face, standing in ranks, it's a lot harder to tell if people aren't quote unquote taking their hits. But at the end of the day, it's about trying to create the most immersive experience, and it's about just trying to have the most fun with it while retaining some sort of educational value, both, again, for the participants and if there's any public watching for them as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, you mentioned inappropriate things. Do you have any stories or interesting anecdotes of what the most inappropriate things you've seen in whether that's like breaking a convention or a rule, or just somebody who's just not, maybe they shouldn't have been there, or it's their first time they're messing something up? What's the most egregious thing that you think you've seen in your days in reenacting?
Oh, Griffin, let me just tell you this. If I wasn't still technically involved with the Revolutionary War hobby in some way in this country, I'm still technically on the board of the Brigade of the American Revolution, although this is my last session because I'm actually no longer with any groups. If I was willing to burn bridges, I could tell you so many stories about so many different groups doing so many different bad things. And that's the beautiful thing, is that every reenactor could do exactly that. Man, reenactors are the worst part about reenacting, let me tell you. Some people might take offense, but then they'll think about it and they'll realize, okay, yeah, I can see what he means. People really do get, super petty about stuff, unfortunately. So I won't tell any, super specific stories, but, again, there are a lot of instances, in my personal memory, and if you watch some of my videos of, first-person reenactment from way back when I did that, when I had, the GoPro and my hat and everything, you'll see instances of that. You'll see instances where, we're standing there and we're shooting, and this one group just, refuses to move. We'll have... Oh, my God, there are instances sometimes, I forgot which event it was, but one event that I was attending as a spectator pretty recently, there was a photographer who was just getting in the way and walking around on the field proper. It's you're not in kit, you don't look the part, and you're getting in people's faces. You realize this is a cannon. It is loaded with gunpowder, real gunpowder. Get out of the way, because then we can't shoot at it or at anything. Stuff like that is unfortunately rather common. Something that's always fun is whenever someone has a drone and it's you're doing the 18th century battle and you just hear over your head the entire time.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, imagine, like you said, with those private events, the immersion is one of the main reasons people are doing those.
Yeah.
And if you've got drones and people running around with cell phones trying to record, or cameras, that would be...
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's in World War II or World War I event, you could probably get away with, dressing up as an actual war photographer. Yeah, but in the 1700s, it's so out of place.
Exactly. And that's kind of my dream impression for World War I is military observer, is one of those reporters, with one of the London newspapers or whatever. I think that'd be really cool. Sometimes at the events, people will allow specific event photographers to come in. Actually, more often than not, whenever I do a World War II event, that's what I'm doing, is I'll still wear my Soviet kit, right? I have the helmet, I have the belting on and all that stuff. But rather than a Mosin, I will run around with, with a camera, and I'll do that. And that's how I get my footage of that stuff. But then, it's unless you're looking directly at the camera, you're not really going to notice it. I'm running around with all the rest of the troops. If they say, get down, I'm going to get down. If, they blow a whistle and they're shouting, Tovarishi, something or other, I'm shouting Ura, and I'm running with the rest of the guys. It's I think the important thing is that if you do stuff like that, it's appreciate that you're still a part of the event and behave appropriately. I'm not going to stand there while a Panzer III has its barrel pointed directly at me oh, look at the camera shots. No, that's a tank. I'm going to get out of the way. It makes more sense that way, right?
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. I think one last thing I just want to ask about reenacting before moving on.
Yeah.
So on the topic of private events and public events, do you think there's any case where, and I'm not saying that I necessarily feel this way, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Is there any area where it could be considered disrespectful? Obviously, if people are in the reenacting gear for a public event, it's serving to also educate the public, and also the reenactors get to almost educate themselves in like feeling what it's like in an immersive experience.
Exactly.
So it kind of works all around. For certain private events, do you think there's ways that it could be done distastefully, or do you have any thoughts on the way that's done, or do you see it as just an extension of reenacting and it's educating just as much the public as it is the reenactors? What are your general thoughts on that?
You really have answered it there. I think that when a private event is done well, it can serve just as much value to the individual reenactor as it does to the public. And ultimately as well, I think that the education of the reenactment community is really, really important. Because unfortunately, a lot of myths and misconceptions can be spread by reenactors and such. So the more that we can do to get those guys, get us, I'm one of them, like up to snuff and on a good page, that's really valuable. That's really important. Now that being said, it's definitely possible as well, though, to have an event that is ultimately disrespectful or that goes a little bit too far. I know that my line for that is definitely further than a lot of people's. One friend of mine, actually who I do World War I with now, he has a pretty strict line where he's like, I'm okay with reenacting like military engagements for the educational value and everything, but I also understand the inherent like kind of weirdness about that and how like in some circles that's not really okay. That's fair. Which I agree with, that's totally fair. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But he also has a line where it's like, I don't think it's okay to reenact like war crimes. I will not consent anything that is like basically non-consensual in history outside of like conscription and combat itself. You know what I mean? So like no firing squads, no bayonettings, stuff like that.
Right.
Now, on an academic level, yeah, fair dues. That's understandable. That being said, I have also gone around after my World War II events, be like, "Hey guys, we're doing war crimes. You up for a war crime? We're up. All right, we're gonna go do a war crime."
I think I've seen that in some early videos where you had firing squads and things like that.
I have arranged firing squads. I have arranged. Well, that's really it. I've arranged firing squads and all sorts of delightful schemes like that. And footage of it is on YouTube. I think that's some pretty heckin' great footage. Very emotive, very dramatic. Man, some guys are really good at taking their hits. They just go straight down. So, where's the line, right? What's the line? The reason why I did, though, like, why I arranged, like, those firing squads, for example, is so that I could get it on film. And I used, at least one of those instances, I used it in a video all about war crimes and how people try to justify them and where the moral line lays and blah, blah, blah. Like, I used it very purposely for that kind of content to sort of make a point. And I also, of course, just recorded because I think that, like, from a historical perspective, it's a really interesting dynamic. It's a weird thing to say, but I am fascinated by war crimes. I am fascinated by genocides in history, by basically humanity being as bad as we can possibly be. One of these days I plan on making a video that's just entirely about the economics of the Holocaust. Before we get to that, though, I want to make a few other videos about the Holocaust to sort of prep my channel and make sure that we can expel any sorts of nasty elements who, may have some, let's just say, misconceptions about the whole thing and what it was. I do think, however, that is a very fine line, and it can very easily go too far. So, for example, if after a battle or whatever, like, the enemy is retreating, or you take a couple of prisoners and you set up a firing squad, and you mow them all down, but then people end up, like, kind of laughing about it and making memes as they go, and, rude gestures, and then going from, like, person to person and executing them with, like, with, like, ahegao faces or whatever. That sort of stuff. Like, okay, I mean, like, I laugh about it now, but I laugh about it because it's just so not cool. Like, that is not the play.
Is that a thing that have you seen someone do that before? Is that actually?
I don't know why that's the first thing that came to mind, but that's where it went. Like, I have not seen that, like, explicitly, like, no explicit circumstance that I can remember, but I've seen, like, people laughing and carrying on and doing weird faces and the stupid
I can also imagine the power trip some guys could go on dressed in, like, SS gear.
See, exactly. Yeah. from my perspective, I know I want to take up one of these days an SS impression just because it's a fascinating history to talk about in YouTube, and because I think that a lot of people looking at someone like me wearing a uniform like that, it would kind of break some wires in the brain, and that thought amuses me.
Right.
I would absolutely be willing to do like an SS impression or whatever. I'd be willing to do war crimes that are reenactment and everything, but I know also that I have committed significant portions of my career to educating people about, like, again, the worst elements of humanity, and I don't shy away from talking about how evil a lot of those guys were and all the messed up stuff that happened, right? Like, I view it as a vehicle to explore those horrible themes. But that being said, I have also encountered individuals, unfortunately even one on YouTube who has a somewhat popular reenactment channel, and he's left comments on my videos.
Yeah, I've seen tons of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there are definitely individuals out there, though, for whom it's like, how can I
fantasy?
Yeah, how can I relate to this? How can I make it seem better?
Yeah.
How can I execute this fantasy? Like, oh no, well actually, the Wehrmacht weren't the ones doing the crimes. Like, oh, shut up. You should know better.
Yeah.
You should really know better if you're the one wearing this uniform, especially. No, there's definitely people out there like that, and that's another reason actually why I really like the private World War II events, is because they tend to be very selective. Like most of the events that I get invited to, I receive a personal DM from the organizer like, hey Brandon, are you free? We'd love to have you come out to this event. They will personally reach out to the individual groups that they want to have get involved, and they will exclude people if they are not like okay with them, if they have not like vetted them beforehand. Which is a pretty effective way to at least to weed out a lot of that stuff. Like, ironically, actually, I have found that the politics, for example, in Soviet reenactment, tend to veer more on, like, for a lot of these guys at least, they tend to veer more on, like, extreme libertarianism than on extreme, like, socialism or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely steps you can take to avoid that kind of thing. But that being said as well, I once met a guy at an event, and he is no longer in the hobby because he has been found out to be what he really is, and he has been outed, and he's been kicked out of basically every group. I once had a man sit down next to me. He's in an SS uniform. He found out that I was Jewish, and he immediately offered me to like join his group because he thought that'd be funny.
Oh my gosh.
And
yeah.
And he said to me, no, man, I love the Jews, man. It's Muslims that I hate. And I'm just like, okay, I don't know how to respond to that. It was my first World War II event, too, so I'm like,
I think as well.
No.
Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank our supporters on armchairhistory.tv. AHTV is our own streaming service that hosts hundreds of history videos with new exclusive content released every single week. By signing up today, you can listen to all of our podcast episodes ad-free and on the go using our mobile app. Additionally, if you upgrade to the Sarge or Officer tier, you gain access to the complete version of every podcast. Use discount code ArmchairChats for 60% off of your first month. Definitely not everybody in the hobby, but I think there's also a group that's attracted to the hobby where if you like nitpicking fine details and you are like super socially unaware, but you can spot all the buttons and everything, you get that crowd who's like there because they know every detail about the uniform, but socially they're going to be inappropriate and not know how to... Or like you said, if you're putting on an improvised performance, that is something that is completely contrary to some people who are there for nitpicking historical details, trying to have this fantasy in their mind, and they're not seeing the big picture of what they're actually part of. So,
that's one of the biggest problems facing the reenactment community is individuals who cannot see the forest for the trees, and they'll get into these... I have, oh my god, the insults that I have seen hurled towards, like, myself and Chris the Redcoat, for example, another reenactor. We both used to be in the same unit, and that unit, unfortunately, it has a pretty, as it turns out, negative relationship with a lot of others in the hobby. Not necessarily through a fault of their own, not necessarily the other guy's fault either. It's just, there's a lot of drama. I won't comment on any of that. Chris and I left because we had a distaste for certain elements of how the organization was run. But because of that drama between like other people in the hobby, like not even Chris and I, but because then we had the audacity to be a member of that unit, we would receive such insanely negative, like, people have referred to like Chris and I as a cancer on the hobby. We're ruining the hobby. We're absolute morons. We don't do any research or whatever. And it's like you ask them to clarify, like, oh, what, do you have a problem with this video? Like what did I say that's wrong? And they won't even call, like, oh, you wore your hat the wrong way. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I'll tilt it 2 degrees more to the left. Are you happy with it now?
Right.
That's the sort of stuff that you can sometimes encounter. Yeah, a lot of people, unfortunately, don't really have a lot of social wherewithal in the hobby. Not to say that I'm a social, not to say that I'm very charismatic either, but that's definitely an issue with the hobby. Yeah. There's a lot of that kind of stuff, and I think in general, really, a lot of the history community in general can deal with that kind of thing. It's oftentimes assumed that you're of a certain political stripe if you are into like this kind of history. It's assumed that everyone cares more about like, then this division marched up the hill and the other division fought them back and blah blah blah. Like a lot of times people will care more about that than the wider concerns that military history entails.
Just shifting a little bit, we're talking about performance, and we're talking about a couple colleagues that you've got, like Chris the Redcoat. I saw a picture on, I think it was on Twitter or something, of you attending the premiere of the Sudbury Devil. And that kind of goes into, it reminded me of, especially because it goes into not reenacting, but having those historical impressions and detailed uniforms and that sort of thing. Yeah. And something I've heard about the film, too, is that they took the authenticity very seriously.
They did,
But you attended the premiere of it. For those who don't know about the film or who made it, and what your opinions are on it, I'm curious if you could give a bit of an introduction. Obviously, you didn't make it, but you were there on the premiere. You know about it more than me.
Yeah. So the Sudbury Devil is a 17th century horror film made by Atunche Films, Andy Rakich. He's a good friend of mine. We've known each other actually for quite a while now. Through YouTube, we met, much like how you and I met. Long story short, without going into too many spoilers and without like launching into the full review, which I have a video about, obviously, the entire idea is like a witch finder is like hired, is brought in by a town because it's like, oh hey, this guy says there's spoopum in the woods, and they're like, whoa, spoopum in the woods, that ain't Christian. So they go into the woods, and as it turns out, like, oh yeah, there's some heckin' spoopum stuff happening in the woods, and there's a lot of themes with sexuality. There's a lot of themes with violence. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of sexual violence in the movie. It is bloody. It is explicit. It is dramatic. It is exceedingly well acted. The material culture is really good. The music is like spectacular. I cannot even express how much I love that soundtrack. But yeah, it's really good, but it's also definitely not a movie for everyone. Specifically because of how visceral some of that violence can get, and because of how explicit certain sexual scenes are. There's actually not a lot of nudity in the movie, but there's definitely a lot of sexuality. And I'll just leave it at that. If you're a minor, then don't watch the movie. And if you are a sensitive boy, do some reading up, do some research into the movie before you.
Brandon, what is a sensitive boy? What would be that type of?
Someone who doesn't like the spoopums too much. There's no like jump scares or anything. It's just more like, it's just like really anxiety inducing. A lot of the
fair enough.
The movie. It's kind of reminiscent of The Witch, if you're familiar with that movie, because it's all done in the period appropriate pronunciation. So, they don't say, oh, yes, welcome to the Christian colony of Massachusetts. They say, oh, the good Christian colony. It's all, like, in the time. It's really, really authentic in that way. So if you enjoyed The Witch, there's probably a lot for you to find in this movie, but it's a very different movie from The Witch as well. And why do I have a feeling that you're going to ask me about the venue of this premiere?
Oh, I was not going to ask you about it, but I remember seeing something where it was hosted in like a devil worshipping thing, wasn't it, or something like that?
Yeah, it was premiered at the Satanic Temple.
Right.
A lot of people had a lot of interesting things to say about that. Personally, we went around the place and I checked out some of like the artifacts that they had and whatnot. It's definitely not for me. It's not my vibe. I think that the whole Satanism thing is honestly just very silly on many different levels. It feels to me more like a social movement that is disguised as a metaphysical set of beliefs, and I don't go down for that kind of thing. I think that I don't like that. But yeah, that's really about it. Though some people actually did take away, like I think mainly, honestly, the regulars of the Satanic Temple, they were like joking about it. They seemed to actually take away like a pro-satanic message from the movie, but like from my viewing, it's like, I don't know how you guys got that. They're doing like heckin' blood ritual stuff. Like, what are you talking about? This is horrible. Like, I thought the only good guy was the one that a lot of people thought was the worst character for that reason. But again, I don't want to get into spoiler territory. Maybe in like a year from now, when the movie's been out for a while, I can do that.
What's the best way to watch the movie? Is he still just doing theaters and stuff for now?
Yeah. Right now, I think he's still basically traveling around the country, and they're doing showings like even around the world. If you pay attention to like Atunche's YouTube page and to his Facebook page, they're posting like new showings all the time, all over the place in like major population centers. So it's like, as of right now, I think that's like the best way to see it. I want to say that they're looking at streaming services as well, like eventually, but it's definitely not a movie that's gonna release on YouTube. If it did, it would either have to be like,
oh man,
incredibly restricted, or they'd probably even have to like cut some stuff out. And knowing Andy, he probably doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, and I feel like with projects like, if you put all that money and time and effort into it, there's something that, like, maybe I would have felt different about this when I first started on YouTube. But if you build a project like that, to give it away for free on YouTube, like, I feel like I would if I built a whole movie like that, I would value it more to put it up somewhere where someone, even if it's just a couple $, to just, if I think people sometimes also forget the amount of effort or don't realize for a YouTuber to make a movie and for it to look, and I've seen like even the trailer, I went into it thinking, oh, this will be something I can make fun of. Look, a YouTuber's doing, and I looked at it and went, oh, actually,
that's the thing.
Looks,
is like, going into a movie like that, I drove out to Massachusetts. Not as much because, like, oh, I'm just that excited to watch the movie. I thought it was going to be good. I was excited to see it, but, like, if it was just to watch the movie, I would not have driven 14 hours to make that happen, I was there to support my friend in his project. But that being said, like going into a movie like this, you're always going to have certain expectations. Oh, okay, it's a YouTuber-made movie, it's low budget, shot in the woods, blah, 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 blah. Like, there are certain expectations of quality that come with that.
Yeah.
You can't blame it for not meeting, like, certain standards, but because it's a low budget and everything. But you're going to have those expectations. The movie blew me away. There's, like, maybe, like 2 or 3 moments in the movie where it felt like that, like, lower budget. Like, oh, yeah, you can tell this was, like, not a Hollywood production or whatever. But, like, for most of the movie, it just felt so professional. It nailed it. Again, I don't want to like go into specifics by listing off individual scenes and such, but a lot of times it just really nailed what it was trying to do, and it felt like something a lot more than what it is on paper, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm always rooting for YouTubers doing their own projects and trying to just do more than what's on the platform, especially given that YouTube can be a difficult environment sometimes to either make the type of content you want to do or fund larger content or projects. You're kind of stuck to a single format for the most part, and if you deviate out of that format, you're not going to get the ad revenue or the sponsors or so that can be difficult to kind of explore out. So that's, for him taking the risk and it paying off, it's just impressive to see. And I don't know the guy personally, but it's just cool. I'm always rooting for that. Speaking of projects, personal projects, and that sort of thing, you mentioned right. You mentioned a few days, I think, before we did the podcast, that you were working on a board game project about World War One. I think you said it was like just a 2-player kind of back and forth type of thing with cards and a board, or like if you could explain kind of your concept. I know it's super early, but I think it's still fun. When I tell people about game concepts and stuff, it's always fun just to kind of chat about it. I don't think there's ever an expectation that it's a full finished, polished, project, but just to hear a little bit about it, I'd be curious for whatever you're comfortable talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, that's been the big project over these last couple of days that I've sort of been pouring all my extra time into, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. It's sort of a break from the book project that I'm otherwise working on. I have far too many irons and too many fires. But, yeah, the tentative title is Breakthrough 1916, or maybe, like, Breakthrough the Somme or something like that. I've been depending on if I... like how specific I want to get with it or how broad. But the entire idea is that rather than being a traditional war game where you have different divisions and you're directing which one you want to go where and all that stuff, and you're drawing cards and everything, the entire idea is that you are probably like a divisional or some level like that commander in the First World War on the Western Front, and you are tasked with getting a breakthrough. It's like your job is to secure a breakthrough of the enemy's trench line so the cavalry can pour through, and you'll have that like traditional victory that people were hoping for, like still somewhat earlier on in the war when trench warfare hadn't quite been perfected yet. And so the entire idea is that the game is largely held in like two main phases. In the first phase, the preparation phase, both players are simultaneously building up their trench line. They're fortifying their trenches. They're putting in machine gun installations and upgrading their artillery and laying barbed wire, and they're conducting certain like cursory offensive actions like trench raids, or like raids to go out and like cut out some wire and clear ways to take prisoners, things like that. Reconnaissance aircraft to figure out what the enemy's doing, stuff like that. And then alongside all those like defensive preparations, you're also plotting out and you are timetabling, sort of like a diplomacy-esque there, if you're familiar with that game. Oh, I know you are. You're timetabling on a piece of paper what your grand offensive is going to be. And, you have to spend the preparation phase like making sure that you have enough supplies at the front, and you have the communications established, and you have your reserves set up and everything. Basically getting yourself ready to launch the offensive that you have planned. It's a race, basically. It's going to be for the first side to finish their offensive, and then I like to envision that they blow a whistle when they're all set up, and they declare, right, I'm ready to begin my offensive, and that begins the offensive phase of the game, the second phase, where that side that finished it first launches their offensive. They push out across no man's land, they see what they can accomplish, and the offensive phase only ends either with a breakthrough or with the offensive side no longer being capable of carrying out their attack. So it's like, eventually, if you run out of supplies, you run out of materials and everything, and you have to make that decision, like, right, I have to pull back, I can't do this anymore because I'm not breaking through the enemy lines, then the offensive can end. And either then both players can decide, right, we're going to end the game there, it ends in a stalemate, or the other side can then launch their own offensive and see if they can break through the now weakened enemy defenses because they don't have as much supply and manpower and whatnot. I want the board game as much as possible to evoke that back and forth sense and basically get this idea across to people that trench warfare was not simple. It was not... basically, you have that entire cadre of individuals out there who are like, oh yeah, Butcher Haig and the donkey officers who had no idea what they were doing. Oh, they were so stupid, walking into enemy machine gun fire, blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, well then if you think you can do better, here you go. These are the material circumstances that these guys are facing. You can't just have the war carry on forever until something happens. You have to get a breakthrough, because the longer the war goes on, more and more people die. The more and more, like your fabric, the home society and everything is falling apart, trying to sustain the war effort and all that. It's like, okay, like here you go. Get the breakthrough. Do better if you think that you can. And I'm hoping that for the vast majority of times, that is not going to be possible. I want the average game to end in stalemate. Now, the challenge is also making that fun. That's
Yeah.
what I'm hoping to achieve.
You mentioned something like whoever has their attack ready or their battle plan ready first. Is that? Or do you mean to say like whoever finishes writing first, like whoever's written their plan out first? Like,
Yeah, no,
are you rewarding
so,
the
yeah,
person
no.
who's just being quicker?
It's like a penmanship competition more than anything.
Yeah.
No, not so much that. I don't want the game to be like rush, rush, rush. It's actually going to be a pretty slow moving, like ponderous thinking kind of game, you know? So the entire idea is that you're writing out your offensive as time goes by, right? Just like naturally in the background or whatever. You write out your initial plan, then you do a turn and you change the plan, and then you change the plan again and refine it and all that. You can be doing that whenever, and you can ask for however much time you need to make sure that that happens, yeah? But the entirety is that during the preparation phase, there are going to be like turns, quote unquote. Like each player will be able to conduct 3 actions, whatever those actions are. Laying cards on the field, upgrading certain pieces of infrastructure and equipment, things like that.
And they can see what their enemy is doing for each of these. So they are each doing 3 actions at the same time.
Yeah.
They execute on those 3 actions, like building fortifications, and then they respond to how they see. Because I could imagine if you're kind of doing it blind or just doing all your prep work on your own, there can almost be a meta that forms where it's like, oh, this is just the most optimal possible way you should play.
Yeah.
But if there's some reactivity to how the enemy's preparing, and that would be, I think that's
so like the way it's kind of difficult to explain without like showing the board and whatnot because it is still very early stages and everything's really still in flux. But the basic idea that I have, right, is like say on turn, like on at the beginning of the game or whatever, I'm planning out my offensive and I say, all right, we're going to have an infantry push on Sector 3, supported by a rolling barrage and a box barrage on the other 2 sectors on the flanks to make sure that that the other sections of the trench can't support where I'm pushing forward with the infantry. I write all that out. Then we have phase 1. I have 3 cards. I lay down 1 card to reinforce 1 sector with machine guns. I lay down 1 card that is going to build up like a light railway infrastructure behind the trench sector that I'm planning on having the infantry push, because I'm going to need a lot of resources in that sector to supply the men and materiel to make that push happen. And then I do a 3rd card that is a feint card. I put a feint card on the other end of the trench sector to make it look like I'm doing something, but the enemy doesn't know what it is until they do a recon and they reveal that card and they find out like, oh, it was a fake out. They're trying to make me think they're planning something there when I'm actually planning something on the other side.
I assume with those like you're revealing a card, so you don't know it's a feint until you flip it and then you see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Certain cards will have only one side, and like you can play it in a way that is hidden.
Yeah. Okay, that's
so
cool.
like machine guns, mortar nests, things like that. You'll be able to like hide those from the enemy until they reveal what it is.
That's cool.
Same thing with like troop preparations. Like the enemy isn't going to know where exactly you're planning your offensive. The only way that they can tell where you're planning your offensive is if they scout out like, oh hey, they're establishing a lot of like railway connections on this sector. They're probably planning a big push there because they need to get those resources to the front. All right, so say that like I do all that though, right? And then I look on the other side and it's like, whoa, hey, Griffin just laid down all like 3 of his moves in 1 sector where I don't have anything at all. Okay, that's that's a change situation. I need to change how I'm going to carry out my offensive as a result of that. Or like say, for some reason you suspect that I'm planning something in Sector 3 and you just like beef up Sector 3. You put down bunker systems and preparatory barbed wire and like machine gun nests or whatever. It's like, oh, well, I can't push there anymore. I'd better change the timetable of my offensive to deal with all of those new problems. And you can also do things like you can use artillery in that preparatory phase to try and like destroy the enemy's barbed wire, to clear it out and whatnot. So say I spend like 4 preparatory phases, shelling the heck out of you, trying to destroy all your wire, but then I send over a trench raid and they're like, hey, all this wire is still completely intact. It's like, oh, okay, I cannot do this offensive. I have to cancel it. But then I canceled the offensive, which I was planning and prepping for. I was so involved with that, trying to make sure I had enough resources for the offensive. Then you launch your offensive, and it's like, well, I'm on the back foot now. Yeah. I have to reorient all these resources from my reserves to the front line. Things like that. So the entire idea is, like, I wanted to have a certain element of mystery, trying to figure out what the enemy's doing. I'm aiming to have it be largely like a resource management game, where the entire point is, like, you know, it's not about, like, having the 5th and the 8th Division advance up this front. It's more about, like, hey, infantry waves are going over the top right now. Can you keep it supplied with more men and more ammunition to make sure that they can keep on going? This offensive is going to need, like, 1 million shells to be fired. Can you get those shells to the front in time?
Thanks for listening. To hear the full version of this chat, become a Sarge or Officer tier member over on armchairhistory.tv. Use code ArmchairChats for 60% off of your first month.